These pyramid texts are the earliest surviving recensions of what we now know as the Books of the Dead, the ancient Egyptian Books of the Dead, and they concern the mystery of life and death and what it is we're doing on this planet. They're very deep, they're very profound. And they are, it seems to me that they were putting in writing there what the Great Pyramid does in architecture alone. The Great Pyramid does it entirely symbolically in architecture. In the later pyramids, they expressed it in texts. And all of these texts, whether it's the pyramid texts, which are the oldest surviving, the coffin texts, because they're written inside the lids of coffins, the book of what is in the Duat, which you'll find painted on the walls of many of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and the Books of the Dead, which were papyrus scrolls that were placed with the deceased inside the coffin. All of these seek to prepare us for the journey that the ancient Egyptians believed that we will face, that we will confront on our own deaths. And the ancient Egyptians regarded the issue of life and death as extremely important. Our civilization kind of avoids the subject of death, really. We don't want to know about death. We try to shove it away to the margins and not think about it. And least of all, to prepare ourselves psychologically and spiritually for that moment that will come to us all. The ancient Egyptians put their best minds to work for 3,000 years on considering the mystery of death and what we may or may not confront when we die. And when it comes to these matters, I would rather listen to the ancient Egyptians than any bloody modern scientist. Because the modern scientists are just pygmies, you know. They're infants, they're children. They may be able to weigh, measure, and count brilliantly, but they know nothing of matters of the spirit. We need to turn to civilizations like ancient Egypt, the ancient Maya, and to surviving shamanistic cultures around the world to understand really the mysteries of life and death. So let's have a little bit of a look at the Egyptian story. These are the souls of Pe and Neken. They're a mysterious brotherhood that was entrusted with transmitting the religion of Osiris to the future. So important was it that it had to be preserved and passed down from generation to generation. Osiris was the first king. He lived in the legendary first time. He was the civilizer. He brought civilization to Egypt. And he was murdered by his antagonist, Set, and 72 conspirators, and his body was hacked to pieces and reassembled and revivified through the magic of Isis, the goddess Isis. And here we see that what happens next is Osiris is brought back to life so that he can inseminate Isis. She hovers over him in the form of a bird, of a kite, and receives his seed and produces their son Horus, who continues the divine line. And here we see Horus performing the rituals that bring about the resurrection of his father in the heavens. Horus comes to you, O king, that he may do for you what he did for his father Osiris, so that you may live as those in the sky live, that you may be more extant than those who exist on earth. Raise yourself because of your strength. May you ascend to the sky. May the sky give birth to you like Orion. May you have power in your body, and may you protect yourself from your foe. That's from the pyramid texts. And again, this image from the tomb of Seti I, Osiris riding on his boat of stars, showing the way to the future pharaohs of Egypt. Nobody disputes that when the ancient Egyptians looked at the constellation of Orion, they saw it as the figure of Osiris in the sky. This is not a controversial statement. Orion ruled over the celestial afterlife kingdom of the Duat, and the Duat had very specific astronomical coordinates roughly between the constellation of Orion and Leo, and divided by the great river, the Milky Way, which the ancient Egyptians called the winding waterway. And again, all of this is laid out in the books. A lot of this is the work of Robert Bauval. He and I worked together on the message of the Sphinx. When you look at the layout of the pyramids on the ground, of course, everybody in this room is familiar with the Orion correlation theory, Robert Bauval's extraordinary discovery, which has really revolutionized our understanding of Egypt. You find that the three pyramids are representing the three stars of Orion's belt. The Nile is just right for the Milky Way. I'm not suggesting that the ancient Egyptians built the Nile. I'm suggesting that Giza was put where it was because the Nile was there, and it happened to reflect a celestial item that they wanted to draw down. And then we have this lion-bodied monument and constellation of Leo, which I'm going to speak about a bit later. So Osiris ruled in the first time, and we shouldn't be surprised that the astronomical layout contains hints of very ancient origins, and I'll come back to those in a moment. I want to talk about the journey through the Duat, this strange parallel realm, which is at once a place in the heavens and also a kind of underworld with narrow corridors and passageways and strange chambers that you find yourselves in, and monsters and demons, and you have to be prepared for every challenge that you will face there. In fact, that was what your life was for. It was to prepare you for that moment when you make the journey through the afterlife realm. Sometimes the god Anubis would act as your psychopomp, as your guide, leading you through the afterlife. The texts make it clear that there was a great secret in the fifth division of the Duat, which is referred to as the land of Sokar and of Rostau. And it's not an accident that Rostau was one of the ancient names of Giza. In fact, in this image from the book of what is in the Duat, we see a pyramid, we see a sphinx, and we see a hidden chamber with this curious figure, three-headed serpent here, a winged serpent very familiar from this part of the world. Go back inside those chambers and corridors. There's the grand gallery of the Great Pyramid. Here's an image from the book of what is in the Duat. A boat, a huge boat, is buried on the south side of the Great Pyramid. We find boats used in the navigation of the Duat, the narrow corridors and passageways. Strange chambers, here with star gods seated. And the king's chamber. What I'm suggesting is that the Great Pyramid was your journey through the Duat in stone. It was a place where you prepared for that journey. And I think that this room probably has something to do with this scene. And this is called the judgment scene. And it takes place in the fifth division of the Duat, in the hall of Maat. Maat is the goddess of cosmic harmony, of truth, of justice. And she is symbolized by this feather. And here we see the deceased, in this case one of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, because this is from Deir el-Medina on the west bank at Luxor, being ushered into the hall of Maat, which is also called the judgment hall of Osiris. And here in the background we see a set of scales, and there are the scales. Here is the god Thoth, writing on a tablet. This monster is called Amit, the eater of the dead. He is part crocodile, part hippo, and part hyena. And here is Osiris sitting in judgment. The weighing of the heart is the central aspect of this scene. And what we see here, weighed against the feather of truth, of harmony, of justice, is this symbol representing the heart of the deceased. You would not want your heart to weigh heavy with sin. You would not want that to happen because then you might have to face the eater of the dead, and you definitely don't want to do that. It's as if your whole life is weighed up in this moment. These figures here are amongst the 42 assessors in the Judgment Hall of Osiris. They ask you questions. Did you kill? Did you steal? Actually, all the 10 Commandments are there, and another 30 as well. And you're supposed to be able to answer all of them, no, I didn't do that. You're supposed to be to be able to answer in the negative. But so this is moral behavior. But there's a sense that the judgment of moral behavior in the ancient Egyptian judgment scene is only part of the story, as though it's necessary to lead a good life, but not sufficient. It's not alone enough just to lead a good life. It's as though these texts, these ideas are recognizing what I said at the beginning, that comes down to us from many ancient traditions, that it's a precious gift to be born in a human body. And the question that's being asked of you there not only is, did you behave morally and decently towards your fellow humans, but also, did you use that opportunity? You were given an opportunity. Did you use it well? Did you live? Did you really live that life that you were given? Or did you waste it away? That's the second aspect of the judgment scene, and the more difficult and the more complex one. So, Thoth records the verdict. If your heart outweighed the feather, if your life was lived inflicting misery and cruelty and pain on others, if your spiritual potential was utterly frittered away and wasted, this is what you would face. Annihilation, never to be born again, never to come back. Your story is over. It's rubbed out from the book of life. If you've lived your life right, then something wonderful is being proposed, and that's the life of millions of years. And I just want to read a passage from the Normandy-Ellis
translation of the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. I stand before the masters who witnessed the creation, who were with Ra that morning the sun rolled into being, who were with Osiris in the grave as he gathered himself together and burst from the tomb, white with heat, a light and shining god. Hail Thoth, architect of truth, give me words of power that I may recall my years and weave together my history. Hail Thoth, architect of truth, give me words of power that I may form the characters of my own evolution. I stand before the masters who witnessed the generation, who were the authors of their own forms, who rolled into being, who walked the dark, circuitous passageways of their own becoming, who saw with their own eyes their destinies and the shapes of things to come. I stand before the masters who witnessed the working of magic, who were with Isis the evening she became the swallow, and her lamentations filled the air, who were with her as she shook down her black hair and veiled the god's transformation in secret, who witnessed the conception of the divine child, though his coming was yet unrevealed. Hail Thoth, architect of truth, give me words of power that when I speak the life of a man, I may give his story meaning. I stand before the masters who know the histories of the dead, who decide what tales to hear again, who judge the books of lives as either full or empty, who are themselves authors of truth, and they are Isis and Osiris, the divine intelligences. And when the story is written, and the end is good, and the soul of a man is perfected, with a shout they lift him into heaven. Hail Thoth, architect of truth, give me words of power that I may complete my story and begin life anew. I stand before the masters who witnessed the transformation of the body of a man into the body and spirit, who were witnesses to the resurrection when the corpse of Osiris entered the mountain and the soul of Osiris walked out shining. He gathered his heel and his leg. He gathered his arms and his backbones. He gathered the dreams crackling inside the dark cave of his skull. He knitted himself together in secret. He came forth from death, a shining thing, his face white with heat.
Perhaps these monuments formed a sacred landscape in which the afterlife journey was prepared to, the ultimate goal of joining Osiris in the sky, winning the life of millions of years. It's part of an ancient spiritual system, and what it celebrated and nurtured above all else was the gift of life. And yes, the ancient Egyptians sought immortal life, but they did not take it for granted. Here is Thoth writing the name of Ramesses II on the tree of life, the life of millions of years. If you ask the ancient Egyptians where this religion came from, they'd tell you it came from the gods in Zep-Tepi, the first time, when the gods came to Egypt. And here's the second pyramid on the equinox, on the spring equinox. You can see the shadow. It's like a gnomon, shadow running absolutely due west. Clues as to when the first time might have been are actually contained in the monuments themselves, and they require us to understand a little bit about a complicated astronomical phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes. It's accepted that the ancient Egyptians had pretty good observational astronomy, but most mainstream astronomers today would absolutely reject the notion that the ancient Egyptians had any knowledge at all of the precession of the equinoxes. Certainly, astronomy in ancient Egypt was a spiritual rather than a scientific pursuit. There's no doubt about that. I mean, the second shrine of Tutankhamun is particularly interesting in this respect. You can see these initiates connected through the third eye to a star in the sky. It's somehow as though the study of the heavens is part of our fulfilling ourselves as individuals on this planet. But precession of the equinoxes, no, the scholars say they couldn't possibly have known that. It's a process that we think is caused by the pull of the sun and the moon on the Earth. It causes the Earth to wobble like a top, which is slowing down, and that wobble takes 26,000 years, actually 25,920 years to complete one great cycle. And it unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. Each of the 12 constellations of the zodiac gets 30 degrees along the ecliptic, the path of the sun, and the precession runs in the opposite direction to the normal direction of the zodiac. It goes backwards, it's precessing backwards. You have roughly 2,160 years in each house of the zodiac, and these are thought to define the age. So this is why we say we live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius, because in our time, the sun is moving out of Pisces on the spring equinox and moving into Aquarius. It isn't quite there yet. We're not in the age of Aquarius. We're perhaps not even on the cusp. Another 100, 200 years, and we'll be much closer to the beginning of the age of Aquarius than we are today. Also from the second shrine of Tutankhamun, this rather mysterious image, Mehen, the enveloper, the serpent of cyclical time, he who hides the hours. I think this is one of many references to the secret knowledge of precession in ancient Egypt. And the Sphinx is part of the way that we can reveal this, a marker on the clock of time. The Great Sphinx, it looks perfectly due east. It's aligned absolutely perfectly to due east. And Santa took this photograph from the back of the Sphinx, looking in the direction of the gaze of the Sphinx. And this photograph at dawn on the spring equinox from the back of the Sphinx. And there you can see the proof. The Great Sphinx gazes directly at the rising sun on the spring equinox. Summer solstice, the sun is way over here. Winter solstice, it's way over here. Spring equinox, dead in line with the gaze of the Sphinx. And I'll just take another moment to do another short reading about the ancient Egyptian concept of the sun. Men praise thee in thy name, Ra, and they swear by thee, for thou art Lord over them. Thou hearest with thine eyes, and thou seest with thine, thou hearest with thine ears, and thou seest with thine eyes. Millions of years have gone over the world. I cannot tell the number of those through which thou hast passed. Thou dost pass over and dost travel through untold spaces, requiring millions and hundreds of thousands of years to pass over. Thou passest through them in peace, and thou steerest thy way across the watery abyss to the place which thou lovest. This thou doest in one little moment of time, and then thou dost sink down and dost make an end of hours. Astonishingly sophisticated notion of the big numbers and distances involved in the sun. So the Sphinx gazes at the rising sun at dawn on the spring equinox. And it does that every year in all times. What changes is the stellar background against which that sunrise is occurring. That's what's changed by the precession of the equinoxes. Precessional drift occurring at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. 30 degrees gives you 2,160 years. The whole process, 12 houses of the zodiac, takes you 25,920 years. And using the science of precession, looking at the monuments of Giza, I can tell you that this diagram on the ground, the Sphinx and the three great pyramids, maps the sky not as it looked in 2,500 BC, but as it looked in 10,500 BC. 12,500 years ago, when the constellation of Leo housed the sun on the spring equinox, and the great Sphinx gazed at her celestial counterpart in the heavens, the Milky Way and the Nile, the three stars of Orion's belt and the pyramid. Very strange, this. Does it tell us that the ancient Egyptians knew that date and wanted to memorialize it in stone, or does it suggest actually that some of these monuments may actually go back to that very ancient time, long, long, long before the pharaohs of Egypt? I'm going to move a little quickly, but the work on precession of the equinoxes, the fundamental work is Hamlet's Mill by Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschend. It's a tough read. Giorgio de Santillana was a professor of history of science at MIT. But what they document in that book is global, worldwide knowledge of precession of the equinoxes recorded in myth. A series of numbers that keep coming up again and again and again, all over the world, in every part of the world, which only can arise from precession. And Santillana and von Deschend hid it in the little paragraph right in the middle of the book. They traced it back to some almost unbelievable ancestor civilization of remote antiquity. 72 is the heartbeat of the cycle, lots of numbers. 72 divided by 2 is 36, 72 plus 36 is 108, half of 108 is 54. All these are what I call the precessional numbers, which are derived from and related to the process of precession of the equinoxes. And you find them in myths, in Viking myths, in Indian traditions. The story of Osiris and his 72 assailants, the number of stanzas in the Rig Veda, it's just all over the world, in myth everywhere, the story of precession of the equinoxes in numbers.